This is the physiology review for Keith Simmons. This is the second part. So we have a 50-year-old woman with congestive heart failure. She has ascites, excuse me. What characteristics of the abdominal vasculature would cause fluid to preferentially accumulate in the abdomen? So recall that edema, which is effectively what this is, just fluid accumulation in the abdomen instead of like skeletal muscle or lung tissue, is a balance between filtration caused by hydrostatic pressure in the vessels pushing fluid out across the wall, and reabsorption, which is the increased osmolarity or the increased oncotic pressure in the vasculature, pulling it back in across the wall. And ordinarily there is a slight excess self-filtration over reabsorption, and that is why you get lymph formation. And this is true in the abdomen as well. Now I've got the liver here because it's a very good example of how the balance of these two is disrupted. You also do get some edema due to leakage across the intestinal vasculature as well. So two things to note about these capillaries. The first thing is in both the intestines and in the liver, you have a very, very high permeability of these capillary walls to protein, okay? And the reason is because your liver actually makes protein, it makes albumin, and that albumin has to be able to get into these sinusoids, which are effectively the capillaries of the liver. And of course, in your GI tract and your intestines, you're absorbing a lot of things that you take in as fuel, and so those capillaries tend to be fairly permeate as well. And so you've got a very small oncotic gradient across this wall, a very small osmotic gradient, because these capillaries, particularly in the liver, they tend to be very permeate to the proteins that would ordinarily be trapped inside this capillary, okay? So you have decreased reabsorption. You also, particularly in the liver, you have decreased filtration. And the reason is because the liver is part of the portal system, the hepatic portal system, and it is second in line. So you get a drop in blood pressure as blood flows across the capillaries in the GI tract, and then it enters the portal vein, and the pressure in the portal vein is really pretty low. Okay, so your pressure in your capillaries is pretty low too. It's about 8 to 9 millimeters. Normal is about 25, as you guys know. So in addition to the decreased reabsorption here, particularly in the liver, we have a decrease in filtration as well, because the capillary hydrostatic pressure is much less than normal, okay, about a third. So the liver in particular is like a swamp, where not much is flowing here. You're not really reabsorbing much fluid, and you're not filtering much fluid. And what that means is that it's very, very easy to disrupt the balance. So if you get an increase in venous pressure, let's say in your vena cava, then that pressure is going to cause a relatively big increase in the capillary pressure here, because there really isn't very much maintaining this balance of fluid here. I mean, it's basically just static, where not much fluid is moving at all. So it's very easy to shove more fluid out if you increase this capillary hydrostatic pressure just a little bit. And that tends to cause fluid buildup in the abdomen, whereas you may not typically get it in maybe some other places where the capillary pressure is more normal, where the filtration relative to the reabsorption is more normal. Okay. Where is the resistance to blood flow in the lungs the highest? In the apex, or in the base, or in the middle? The answer is the apex, and the reason is because if you have an individual who's standing upright, gravity pulls all the tissue downward, okay? And this is a fairly low pressure system, and this vasculature the walls are very highly compliant, which means they stretch really easily. You get big increases in volume to small increases in pressure. So when you tilt upward, gravity pulls blood down, columns of blood are pushing down onto the base of the lung, And that causes the volume to increase here. And because these walls are so compliant and so stretchy, you get an increase in diameter, and that decreases the resistance to flow. And of course, the opposite takes place up here at the apex. So the higher resistance to flow is in the apex in the upright individual. The lower resistance to flow is in the base. Okay? So a 20-year-old man is in a car accident and he hemorrhages 0.5 liters of blood, but I added a little, I didn't want to make this too tough. I gave you guys hemorrhage at least twice as an example. But I added a pacemaker, which is the sole determinant of heart rate. So now my heart rate can't change. So I decrease blood volume, I decrease central venous pressure, I decrease stroke volume, decrease cardiac output, decrease MAP, no change in TPR or heart rate or inotropic state or contractility in the direct response. So that's really not different than normal. What's different is in the reflex response, we have decreased mean arterial pressure, decreased impulses to the brain, increased total peripheral resistance, increased MAP. Everything's the same up till then. Ordinarily, we would then increase the heart rate, but this time we're not doing that because we have a pacemaker, which is the sole determinant of heart rate. Okay, so we go next to inotropic state instead. That goes up, stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up, central venous pressure falls, and the reflex response. So now we add them up. The mean arterial pressure is slightly down, always slightly in the direction of the direct response. Inotropic state up, central venous pressure up. Don't know about stroke volume. Heart rate is 0. I don't know about cardiac output. Total peripheral resistance is up. So now, because this is up and this is going, or this is up and this is down, how do we determine that this was down? MAP is equal to TPR times cardiac output. If MAP dropped and TPR rose, cardiac output must have dropped. Okay, so here we have a decrease in cardiac output, no change in heart rate, so you know the stroke volume must have dropped because you can't have the stroke volume going up with no change in heart rate and have cardiac output going down. Our causal relationship will not stand if that's the case. Okay, so that's the solution to that problem. Most of you guys did pretty well on the readiness assessment on that. You have a man who's in a car accident. Once again, he hemorrhages the blood. He has the pacemaker, and this time it's a slightly different question. What is his sympathetic tone relative to a man without a pacemaker? So the answer is the sympathetic tone must be higher, and the reason is because the man with the pacemaker has to bring his mean arterial pressure up without the help of heart rate. So that means he's going to have to increase his total peripheral resistance and his contractility a little bit more than the man that has an increase in heart rate to help out at increasing this mean arterial pressure. So that means that your sympathetic tone must be a little bit higher in order to cause a little bit more vasoconstriction, a little bit more increase in contractility to get that mean arterial pressure back up where it belongs. So he has a slightly increased sympathetic tone relative to the man without the pacemaker, where that guy can use his heart rate. The man with the pacemaker can't in this case. Okay? This is our problem. This is basically straight out of CircSim, where the tumor falls onto the vena cava and it decreases the diameter. So this increases venous resistance, okay? And so that decreases central venous pressure because you've got increased pressure upstream of our decrease in diameter, our tumor falling on our vena cava. So that increases the peripheral venous pressure and volume, but downstream of the tumor, the central venous pressure, particularly the pressure in the right atrium, is going to drop because our venous return is going to drop. And so that decreases stroke volume, that decreases cardiac output, that decreases mean arterial pressure, and we have no change in heart rate, no change in total peripheral resistance, and no change in inotropic state. A reflex response is as normal: increased TPR, increased MAP, increased heart rate, increased cardiac output, decreased central venous pressure, decreased stroke volume, increased cardiac output, limits the stroke for the fall in stroke volume. And now you add them up: inotropic state, CVP, stroke volume, heart rate, all obvious, total peripheral resistance obvious, mean arterial pressure always slightly in the direction of the direct response. And so now our only unknown is cardiac output, which went down in the direct response, up in the reflex response. If mean arterial pressure falls, mean arterial pressure is equal to TPR times cardiac output. This fell, this rose, cardiac output must fall. You can't have an increase here and here and have a decrease here. Our causal relationship will fail if you have that. So it must have gone down, okay? You give a woman an alpha blocker, which causes a vasodilation. What is the new steady state? By the way, this only asked for the reflex response, so when you actually look at the answer, it matches the reflex response here. They put that in all caps. Just so, and occasionally I do ask a question like that. It's supposed to be a gimme, because I think all you guys can do a reflex response. But it's supposed to be easier than having to add them up and determine steady state. But if you miss this, then you're going to be putting in steady state parameters, not reflex parameters. Don't let that happen to you, okay? In this case, I do want steady state. So we've got vasodilation, which is a decrease in total peripheral resistance, and a decrease in mean arterial pressure. And right now on this problem, that's as far as I've gotten. And I'm not going to change anything else. My stroke volume still hasn't changed. And when you get to the end of your problem, if you still haven't changed stroke volume, then that's when afterload comes into effect. Afterload is weak. You only use it when you haven't changed stroke volume yet. So in this case, decreased MAP increases stroke volume, increased cardiac output, decreased central venous pressure, no change in heart rate or inotropic state. Okay, the reflex response is as usual: vasoconstriction, increased TPR, increased MAP, increased heart rate, increased cardiac output, decreased central venous pressure, decreased stroke volume. The increase in inotropic state or contractility limits the fall in stroke volume. Remember, your body doesn't care about stroke volume. It can go down, and your cardiac outputs, as long as it's going up and MAP is going up, your body doesn't care. So in this case, contractility limits the fall in stroke volume. And then you add them up: increase, decrease, increase, increase, don't know, decrease. If MAP goes down, cardiac output goes up, TPR must have gone down. Cardiac output went up, heart rate goes up, so that really doesn't tell us anything about stroke volume. That causal relationship can hold if stroke volume goes either way. So now 95% of the time you go with the direct response. Once again, this is an exception to the rule because afterload is a very weak response, and in this case the reflex response will be relatively strong because an alpha blocker is going to cause a lot of vasodilation and you'll get a nice big increase in heart rate. So in this case, you go with a reflex response. 95% of the time you go with this. In this case, the afterload is really weak, so you go with the reflex instead. Okay? All right. What would you expect to happen to the frequency of impulses in a man with congestive heart failure? So you guys know with congestive heart failure, your central venous pressure tends to rise because your cardiac output is falling. Okay? So if your central venous pressure rises, that means your atrial pressure and volume is going up. So you have two kinds of atrial volume receptors. Type A tend to respond to stretch. So here's your ECG, here's your P wave, and here's the increase in atrial pressure that follows that, and in atrial pressure, and that's when your type A tend to fire. Your type B tend to fire with stretch. So after your ventricles have contracted and then While ejection is taking place, blood is accumulating in the atrium because your mitral valve is closed. Blood continues to flow and it accumulates in the atrium, and so that stretches the atrial walls. And so you get this gradual increase in pressure due to the increase in volume, and that stretches your atrium. As your blood flows, it stacks up against that closed mitral valve, and your walls stretch, and when they stretch, you increase the firing in type B. And then your mitral valve opens, your T wave hits here, you're getting relaxation, your mitral valve finally opens, and then your volume receptors stop firing. The impulse frequency increases as the blood volume goes up.